What if I told you that one of the most miraculous events in World War II didn't involve a grand battle, but a retreat? That what looked like defeat from the outside was, in truth, the moment the free world dug in its heels and said, "Not today." Most people think of Dunkirk as just another chapter in a history book. Some boats, some smoke, maybe a movie scene with stirring music. But they're missing the real story. Because Dunkirk wasn't just an evacuation, it was a heartbeat, a pulse of resilience when Europe was seconds away from flatlining under the boot of tyranny. And the craziest part, the people who pulled it off weren't just generals and admirals. They were fishermen, shopkeepers, teenagers with no training and too much heart. It was messy, desperate, improvised, and it worked. This isn't about glorifying war, it's about understanding what happens when ordinary people refuse to give up, when courage shows up in the cracks, when a tiny window opens in the middle of total disaster and someone climbs through it. Dunkirk is a masterclass in survival, sacrifice, and stubborn hope. So if you've ever felt cornered, overwhelmed, or two steps from giving up, this story is for you. Because what happened on those beaches in 1940 still whispers a truth the world needs now more than ever. When everything seems lost, it might just be the beginning of something unbreakable. It all started with lightning. Not the kind that flashes across the sky, but the kind that rolls across Europe on steel tracks and tank treads, fast, ruthless, and relentless. Germany's blitzkrieg wasn't just strategy. It was shock therapy, delivered at gunpoint. In spring 1940, while most of Europe was still rubbing its eyes from the so-called phony war, the Wehrmacht hit the ground running. No warning, no hesitation. One moment the Allies were in formation, the next they were scrambling for survival. Instead of the expected frontal assault through Belgium like in World War I, the Germans pulled a wild card, the Ardennes. Dismissed as impassable, it turned out to be the perfect backdoor. General Manstein's plan sliced through with surgical precision, catching the French and British completely off guard. Their tanks were out of position, their communication was a mess, and their morale already wobbling. The road to Dunkirk had just been paved by enemy hands. As the German armor surged forward, it was like watching dominoes fall in high speed. The Allies, outmaneuvered and overwhelmed, fell back to the coast. Town after town, stronghold after stronghold, collapsed under pressure until the only escape was westward, to the sea. That's where the trap closed. In a matter of days, more than 400,000 troops found themselves pinned between German firepower and the cold waves of the English Channel. Panic spread like wildfire. French troops looked to British lines, British soldiers looked to the sea, and commanders looked to maps that no longer made sense. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a humiliation, wrapped in disbelief. What had gone wrong? How could this happen so fast? The truth was brutal. The Allies had prepared for yesterday's war while Germany invented a new one. And just like that, Dunkirk wasn't just a dot on the map anymore. It became a desperate goalpost for survival. But before we dive into the chaos on those beaches, we've got to understand why no one saw it coming in time, even though the warning signs were there all along. At first, war felt oddly quiet. After Britain and France declared war on Germany in 1939, people expected thunder and instead got a weird, almost polite silence. No bombs, no charges, just soldiers sitting in trenches, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Newspapers had called it the Sitzkrieg, but the silence wasn't peace. It was the deep breath before a sucker punch. The French trusted in concrete, the Maginot Line, a fortress so massive it looked invincible on paper. But war doesn't follow blueprints. Germany, clever as ever, just sidestepped the whole thing like a schoolyard dodge. Meanwhile, British troops crossed the Channel full of optimism, tea in hand, assuming this would be over by Christmas. Nobody thought the storm would come from the forest. Behind that curtain of calm, Germany was moving like a chess master. They weren't just planning an attack. They were staging a spectacle of speed and psychology. While the Allies waited for an encore of World War I trench warfare, Hitler's generals rewrote the entire playbook. They didn't want to fight fair. They wanted to finish the match before the referee even noticed it started. And boy, did they succeed. The scary part? It was all preventable. British and French intelligence had clues, but they were lost in layers of bureaucracy and wishful thinking. Politicians hoped Hitler would calm down. Military leaders assumed old tactics would still work. But hope isn't a strategy. And in 1940, it sure wasn't enough to stop tanks rolling through Belgium like it was a Sunday drive. So when the Blitzkrieg finally burst through, it wasn't just a surprise. It was a punch to the gut. The phony war had lulled the Allies to sleep. And by the time they woke up, the skies were already howling with the sound of something far worse than silence. If the Blitzkrieg was the body blow, the Stuka dive bombers were the scream that came with it. These weren't ordinary planes. They came with a soundtrack, the infamous Jericho trumpets. That high-pitched wail wasn't just noise, it was engineered panic, designed to rattle nerves before the bombs even landed. Imagine being a soldier on the ground, hearing that shriek, and knowing terror was moments away. It wasn't just warfare, it was psychological sabotage. The skies over Sedan became a canvas of smoke, fire, and shattered expectations. French defenses, once confident, crumbled under the noise and fury. Entire units surrendered before a single shot hit the ground, just from the dread those planes brought. It was warfare by intimidation, and it worked like a charm. The Germans didn't just outgun the French, they outfeared them. That's the thing most people don't talk about. Fear moves faster than bullets. And in World War II, the Luftwaffe turned fear into a weapon of mass disarmament. The French line, once seen as unbreakable, now looked like paper in a rainstorm. One strike after another, the Germans pressed forward, relentless, coordinated, and always backed by thunder from above. Dunkirk? It was no longer a distant fallback. It was the last hope. Meanwhile, Allied soldiers started realizing something terrifying. Air superiority wasn't a bonus anymore. It was the whole game. With every Stuka that screamed down from the clouds, morale plummeted, orders got confused, units broke formation, and escape became the only thought in every mind. Even the bravest could only hold their breath for so long, under fire raining from the heavens. But here's the twist. Just when it seemed like the sky belonged entirely to the enemy, something unexpected started stirring in Britain. Not a counterattack, not yet, but a whisper of something bold, something desperate, something with a code name and a plan. It started with a spark, and Churchill lit the match, faced with the nightmare of 400,000 Allied troops cornered at Dunkirk. He didn't flinch. Instead, he launched one of the boldest rescue missions in military history, Operation Dynamo. The name may sound like a science project, but the stakes were life and death. If they failed, the backbone of Britain's army would vanish beneath the waves. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, a man more comfortable behind charts than in front of crowds, was handed the impossible task: get them home. No time, no guarantees, just a shrinking window and a rising tide. And he didn't just rely on warships. He called on fishing boats, ferries, and paddle steamers. Anything that floated was drafted. These became the little ships, and boy, did they punch above their weight. Dynamo wasn't just a mission. It was controlled chaos. Every hour, German forces closed in tighter, and every wave that crashed onto the beach screamed urgency. The troops on shore dug in and waited. The Royal Navy steamed toward hell with decks full of hope. And in pubs across Britain, civilians were literally pulling their boats out of harbors and heading for war. There's something magical about that moment when ordinary people decide they won't sit this one out. Bakers, fishermen, retirees, they all became part of something much bigger than themselves. They weren't armed with much, but they carried courage in spades. And when you mix courage with purpose, you get something no enemy can quite predict or stop. Still, even with all that grit, it wouldn't have worked without one very unusual piece of luck. An overlooked, half-broken pier was about to become the center of the entire evacuation, thanks to the instincts of one sharp-eyed officer. It's funny how the forgotten things often end up saving the day. The eastern mole at Dunkirk wasn't built for evacuations. It was just a long, narrow stone pier meant for docking cargo ships. But when everything else was bombed, shelled, or sinking, that mole became a miracle. Senior naval officer William Tennant looked at it and thought, why not use it? That one decision changed everything. See, getting men from the beach into ships was painfully slow. Boats ran aground, soldiers waded through waist-deep water, and time ticked away like a drumbeat. But the mole? It let troops board ships directly. Fast, organized, efficient. It was like finding a secret shortcut in the middle of a burning maze. Under enemy fire, in total chaos, it stood firm, and the Luftwaffe tried, oh they tried, to take it out. Bombs fell like hailstones, but somehow that battered pier refused to give in. Sailors called it the lifeline. Every hour it held meant thousands more got out. Soldiers lined up by the hundreds, filing onto ships as if walking a tightrope between death and deliverance. Tennant's call wasn't glamorous. It didn't come from a polished war room or a fancy map. It came from gut instinct, born of desperation and clarity. And that's a powerful thing. Sometimes leadership is less about barking orders and more about seeing possibility where everyone else sees rubble. And as the mole did its work, the rest of Dunkirk held its breath. Because while thousands boarded ships, tens of thousands were still buying them time with rifles, grit, and the kind of sacrifice that never makes it into headlines, but changes the course of history. Not everyone at Dunkirk was waiting to be rescued. Some were standing in the way of the storm so others could live. British and French troops held the perimeter like human shields, knowing full well what that meant. Their job wasn't to escape, it was to stall. To hold back the Germans just long enough for the evacuation to keep going. Imagine that, knowing every hour you hold the line, someone else gets to go home. These weren't grand speeches and movie moments. This was mud, blood, and bullets. Some held bridges, others dug into crumbling farmhouses, machine guns clattering until the barrels melted. They weren't just delaying the enemy, they were daring fate. Many didn't make it out. Some were overrun, others captured. Entire units disappeared into the smoke of battle, never to see home again. But their stand was the backbone of Operation Dynamo. Without them, the mole, the ships, the whole rescue would have collapsed like a sandcastle in the tide. It's the kind of courage that doesn't make noise. No medals, no parades, just silent bravery in the face of certain loss. They didn't fight for glory. They fought because someone had to. And that quiet heroism, it's the reason so many thousands did get to see England again. And still, even with bravery holding the line and ships filling up, there were problems. You couldn't exactly build a marina on a battlefield, but that didn't stop these folks from trying. What came next was a mix of grit, genius, and a whole lot of duct tape style improvisation. You know that old saying, necessity is the mother of invention. At Dunkirk, it might as well have been carved in stone. With no docks, no proper infrastructure, and the beach constantly under fire, they had to get creative. Soldiers took abandoned trucks and sunk them in the shallows to create makeshift jetties. Planks were laid across roofs, tires repurposed, ropes pulled tight. It was engineering on adrenaline. What's wild is how well it worked. These ragtag contraptions helped speed up boarding times and saved thousands of lives. When everything else fell apart, human ingenuity showed up. They weren't trained architects, they were desperate troops figuring it out in real time. And that spark of problem-solving right in the middle of chaos was as heroic as any battlefield charge. And let's not forget the weather. At first, it weirdly cooperated. Calm seas, low clouds, and just enough cover kept the operation going longer than it should have. For a brief moment, nature seemed to say, "All right, I got you." But everyone knew it couldn't last. Every gust of wind or clearing sky could shift the odds again, and dramatically. Still, even in that moment of fragile hope, people kept moving, kept building, kept helping. No blueprint, no manual, just guts and grit. It wasn't about titles or ranks. It was about survival, about getting one more man on one more boat before the window slammed shut. But while the skies had been mostly kind so far, that didn't. They were quiet. Up there, just out of sight, a battle was raging, and the ones fighting it, well, they were taking hits, saving lives, and getting none of the credit. At least, not at the time. From the ground, it was easy to think the Royal Air Force had gone missing. Soldiers being bombed on the beaches kept asking the same thing: where are our planes? But what they didn't realize was that just above the clouds, a brutal dogfight was unfolding. The RAF wasn't absent. They were invisible to those below, but fully engaged in a fight to the death. And without them, that beach would have become a grave. Pilots scrambled daily, flying dangerous missions over the channel to intercept Luftwaffe bombers before they could reach Dunkirk. Many flew multiple sorties a day with barely time to eat or rest. They weren't just shooting down planes, they were buying time, one aerial duel at a time. Over 250 enemy aircraft were destroyed during the evacuation. But no fanfare, no spotlight, just fuel, sweat, and silence. The RAF paid a steep price for that heroism. Dozens of pilots never returned, shot down, lost at sea, or simply vanished into the sky. Yet their sacrifice was largely overlooked at the time. To the soldiers getting shelled on the beach, it felt like abandonment. But history tells a very different story, one written in smoke trails and shattered cockpits. Sometimes real courage is quiet. It doesn't always come with cheering crowds or cinematic scenes. It comes in the form of a lone plane diving through flak to stop a bombing run. And every time that happened, it meant fewer bodies on the sand, fewer funerals, more names on the rescued list. And so, while the skies churned with combat and the seas filled with boats, the miracle of Dunkirk was reaching its climax. Ships were returning, beaches were emptying, but this wasn't the end. Because while 338,000 souls were saved, something deeper lingered in the air, something bittersweet. When the ships finally docked in Britain, they didn't bring back victors, they brought back survivors. Over 338,000 Allied troops stepped onto dry land, soaked to the bone, exhausted beyond belief, but alive. Crowds gathered, not to celebrate, but to welcome them home with quiet awe. There were no marching bands, just hot tea, blankets, and trembling hands that had seen too much. On paper, it was a miracle. A rescue so massive, so improbable, it felt like something out of a legend. But Churchill, ever the realist, stood before Parliament and reminded the nation this was no victory. Wars are not won by evacuations, he said, just as the applause began to swell. And just like that, joy turned to reflection. It's easy to cheer for the numbers, the 338,000 saved. But what about the 40,000 left behind? French soldiers who stood their ground and were captured, British troops who ran out of time, families who never got the telegram they were hoping for. Dunkirk was a lifeline, but it came at a price written in names we'll never fully know. Still, something changed in the British people that week. Fear gave way to resolve. Weakness hardened into purpose. Dunkirk showed that even in retreat, there could be unity, strength, and a flicker of something rare: national spirit. It wasn't about winning a battle. It was about refusing to lose the war. And that spirit, It needed words, it needed fire, it needed someone who could take the exhaustion of a nation and turn it into steel. Someone ready to speak not just to history, but directly into the hearts of every soul watching, waiting, and wondering what came next. On June 4th, 1940, Winston Churchill walked into the House of Commons and gave the kind of speech that doesn't just make history, it bends it. The ink was barely dry on the last evacuation log when he stood up, voice steady, and lit the fire Britain desperately needed. No sugarcoating, no false hope, just raw defiance. "We shall fight on the beaches," he said, and the room froze. Every word hit like a drumbeat of destiny. He didn't promise safety, he promised struggle. But it was the kind of struggle worth showing up for. The kind that makes people straighten their backs and say, "All right then, let's go." Churchill's genius wasn't just in language, it was in timing. Right when the nation felt bruised and breathless, he turned survival into resolve. He gave fear a backbone. This speech wasn't just for Parliament, it was for every farmer, factory worker, schoolchild, and soldier. It told them, this isn't the end. In fact, we're just getting started. And no matter where the enemy came, land, sea, or sky, Britain would not roll over. They would not surrender. Not now. Not ever. It wasn't empty bravado either. Churchill knew what lay ahead. More bombings, more losses, more long nights. But he also knew what Dunkirk had revealed, that the British spirit could bend and not break. That ordinary people, when tested, could rise above the moment. His speech simply lit the match under that truth. And with that, the stage was set. The Battle of Britain loomed. The war machine kept turning, and across the Channel, Hitler wasn't finished. But neither was Britain. Because after Dunkirk, something had changed. Not just in strategy, but in soul. What if we treated our own moments of chaos like Dunkirk, not as endings, but as calls to rally, to improvise, to fight for each other when the odds look impossible? Because in the middle of fear and confusion, that's where real character is forged. And just like those soldiers on the beach, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is hold the line, trust the rescue, and believe we're worth saving. So now I'll ask you, what part of your life is waiting for its own Operation Dynamo? Where have you been retreating, when maybe it's time to regroup and rise instead? If this story stirred something in you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There's more history to uncover, more lessons to learn, and more reasons to believe that even the darkest moments can spark miracles. Stick around. You won't want to miss what's next.